How's it going, everybody? So we're back talking some more Cobra Kai on the channel with the second part of the 6th and final season. The build-up to get to this point in the Sekai Taikai tournament has been pretty intense. That's something I've been incredibly excited for, finally getting to see this tournament underway, but also being nervous, pitting Miyagi-Do and Cobra Kai against all these other dojos on an international stage. Full disclosure, by the way, for the most part, this is going to be a spoiler-free review, but I'm going to probably talk some spoilers towards the end, which you'll be warned about before I even go into them. With such high expectations going into part 2 revolving around the Sekai Taikai tournament in general, I certainly believe that it lived up to those expectations. When it comes to ramping up the intensity and posing the biggest leap skill-wise amongst the competition, like Cobra Kai and unfortunately more so Miyagi-Do, for the most part they spend this entire tournament completely outmatched, something that we haven't really seen too often. It's a real struggle for them to keep up with the skill of all these different dojos with the variety of challenges, which in turn does add a greater level of stakes and tension across the multitude of challenges in the Sekai Taikai. Both of them constantly being on the brink of elimination, mixed in with the internal conflicts and drama eating away at them, making them lose all of their focus. Being a big martial arts fan, I'm always going to be very excited about the martial arts battles on display in Cobra Kai. So the actual challenges themselves in the Sekai Taikai tournament, the variety of the different challenges in the tournament adds so much fun to the martial arts. To me, some of these different challenges in the tournament do feel very much inspired by American Gladiator. They have very American Gladiator-esque rules and setup, with some pretty epic team-based battles and fights on top of platforms elevated in the air. Don't get me wrong, there still are plenty of your usual standard martial arts brawls in and outside of the tournament in part 2, and many of those are pretty exceptional, but the best fights in part 2 are within the tournament, especially a huge battle that's in the very last episode of part 2, which I'll probably delve into more in the spoiler section. From the very beginning of part 2, it feels like we are going into peak levels of drama with that big reveal at the end of part 1 that Tori decided to rejoin Cobra Kai. But that isn't the only source of drama that fuels these characters, since the rivalries new and old get pretty juicy in part 2. The best rivalry among everyone in part 2, in my opinion, centered around Robbie and Quan. Both of these characters, it just feels like there's a genuine hatred between them that only escalates further the more they interact with each other. They try to confront each other inside and outside of the ring to compete for dominance. While we only saw bits and pieces of this personality that Quan had back in part 1, he really levels up in every single way in part 2. It is immensely entertaining as a sort of villainous character. He's completely ruthless, cocky, and besides his incredible martial arts skills, he's a master manipulator, doing everything he can to effectively get under Robbie's skin during the Sekai Taikai tournament. Speaking of Robbie, because now he is the captain of Miyagi-Do, I must admit I was a bit frustrated by his character initially. For a long stretch of part 2, he struggles with being able to stay focused since Tori joined Cobra Kai, and in turn that makes him go out there and kind of sort of stink it up during the tournament. I mean, he really gets his ass kicked in most competitions until towards the very end of part 2. The silver lining of Robbie's storyline, however, is the fact that he does showcase some solid growth in the end. Eventually, he does find that fire inside him once again to become a solid leader when the team needs him most. Something, unfortunately, I felt like Tori was lacking in part 2. After the surprise reveal at the tail end of part 1 where she decided to rejoin Cobra Kai for the Sekai Taikai, I don't feel like in part 2 she had any growth whatsoever. She enters part 2 struggling with her decision to rejoin Cobra Kai. In a similar vein to Robbie, it does cause her to be distracted and lose a lot of different competitions during the tournament. That's besides the fact that the majority of Cobra Kai's senseis and students alike don't even like her all that much. So there's never this really big character moment or growth for Tori in part 2. By the end of part 2, she still has complicated feelings about the decisions she made. The only thing of interest for Tori's story in part 2 probably was the feud that she began with Zara from the Iron Dragons. It is a bit of a cliche feud wrapped up in mostly superficial personal boy drama, but I'd be lying if I didn't say it was at least engaging in some regard. The Iron Dragons, out of all the different teams that are introduced in the Sekai Taikai tournament, they are the most interesting. To be fair, the Iron Dragons are pretty much the only team in the Sekai Taikai tournament that we get any sort of development with. I mean, there are a couple of fun moments here and there. One of the teams is led by Britt Baker, which I think is pretty cool as a big wrestling fan. Nevertheless, the Iron Dragons are a pretty awesome addition to Cobra Kai. Sensei Wolf, Zara, and Axel add a lot of great tension into the mix since they're such a powerful dojo who completely dominates the competition early on. Zara probably is the greatest female fighter that we've ever seen in Cobra Kai to this point, and that's something that she definitely knows too. All the time throughout the show, she's proclaiming herself as the queen of karate, and then goes out there and completely dominates whoever her opponent is. Maybe it's just me or it's the creatives involved, but Axel feels like a character that is heavily inspired by Ivan Drago from Rocky IV. He's this mammoth, foreboding presence that doesn't have have the greatest social skills, but is a force to be reckoned with if he's facing someone in the tournament. We don't get a ton of insight into his character. There is a sort of attempt, I guess, because he strikes up a friendship very briefly with Sam, but it pretty much goes nowhere fast, only adding more boy-related drama into the mix with poor Miguel caught in the crossfire. Once I heard that Louis Tan was going to be joining the cast of Cobra Kai, I was incredibly excited, and he definitely lives up to those expectations as Sensei Wolf. Out of all the senseis in Cobra Kai, he's definitely the most brilliant fighter. Arguably is the most ruthless sensei, much more ruthless than Kreese or Silver, especially given that we see him physically and mentally abusing some of these students all for the sake of achieving greatness. While some Miguel fans out there might take some adjusting to the fact that he isn't as much of a focus as in previous seasons, I still think he is a great part of Part 2. He's dealing with a lot of different things with his future, also having to come to terms with not being the captain. I guess you can kind of say he took a little bit of a backseat in Part 2, even if, let's be real, he's probably the best fighter that Miyagi-Do brought to the Sekai Taikai tournament, especially with Robbie going out there and completely bombing it in every event pretty much. Miguel, as per usual, is one of the most exciting parts of all the different martial arts battles. He goes out there and completely kills it in the Sekai Taikai. Multiple times they have him fighting several people at once. To me, that only just made him seem even more badass that he was fighting multiple people at once and usually coming out on top. Outside of the fights, I like a lot of the uplifting pep talks he has with Robbie. He also has some pretty great tender moments with Johnny as well, further strengthening that father and son bond that they have. When it comes to Johnny and Daniel, it kind of feels weird to say this, but oddly, they don't contribute as much as senseis in the Sekai Taikai tournament as I was expecting them to. It's one of the more head-scratching writing decisions for Part 2, having both Daniel and Johnny wrapped up in their own personal dramas that cause at least one of them to usually be absent. Whether it be Johnny, who has to leave and deal with a family emergency and then fly back, or the continued saga of Daniel attempting to uncover the truth behind Mr. Miyagi's mysterious past. Something that as the series goes on and we continue to find out more and more, the results leave me kind of torn. On one hand, I do think it's an intriguing way to sort of test everything that Daniel has ever believed in about Mr. Miyagi, what he learned from him, and in turn that does put him on edge a lot of this series, especially when he does find out that there is a connection between Mr. Miyagi's past and the Sekai Taikai tournament. The hurdles that we go through to get that info, though, are certainly pretty odd, to say the least. Whether that be Daniel getting mugged and thrown into a cage, or a very questionable dream sequence involving Mr. Miyagi that I feel like is probably going to be one of the major takeaways that people are going to be discussing online, just because once you see the scene with Mr. Miyagi and Daniel and what they do here, it's questionable, to say the least, as far as digital necromancy. I was really happy that Chosen decided to return for the Sekai Taikai tournament. He might have returned heartbroken at first, but Chosen really livens up everything and has surprisingly fun interactions with everyone. Best of all are these interactions that he has between him and Kim Daeun. Two of them have surprisingly great chemistry with one another, and get some of the best scenes in Part 2, how they play off one another, uncovering, despite the fact that they're rival senseis, they're more similar than they thought they ever were. If you watch my review for Part 1, one of the things you probably remember me harping on was the logic involved on how in the world can Kreese beat the Sekai Taikai tournament if he's a wanted fugitive. They do address how Kreese can be here being a sensei at the Sekai Taikai tournament, but I'd be lying if I didn't feel like it was a very haphazard attempt at trying to explain away how he can do all of this. Regardless, I still had a good time with Kreese being around. His presence usually is a lot of fun, messing with Miyagi-Do. As much as I love Cobra Kai, occasionally where the show does falter at times is usually when the show tries to do too much. The show always has struggled a bit, for me at least, as far as introducing too many subplots, and Part 2 is no different, with basically everybody having some level of subplot along with the drama involving the Sekai Taikai tournament. And when these episodes are relatively short, they are about like 35 minutes or so, other than the finale, which is like over 40, there's just never enough time to balance out the overall plot. And then there's storylines with the senseis, Miguel, Robbie, Sam, Tori, Dimitri, Hawk, Devin, and Kenny, dealing with various different problems of their own, or some of them are connected in some shape or form. Due to that, some of these storylines are just on the weaker side compared to some of the more interesting ones. For example, Hawk and Dimitri continue to have this really weird friendship rivalry going on, and it continues to be a fairly bumpy experience that I don't dislike or like, really. Of course, carrying on from Part 1, we do have Devin struggling with the decision that she made to cheat to get to the Sekai Taikai tournament, and that guilt that she has kind of gets resolved very quickly. Honestly, one of the details I was kind of most bothered by when it comes to these storylines, if you will, was this overwhelming bitterness that some of the team had directed at Kenny, believing he may betray them when he's brought in as a replacement later on, and this belief that just because Tori decided to go and betray them and join Cobra Kai, they feel like he could could be some level of traitor or double agent as well, when he's shown no signs of doing so. Unfortunately, also by now, I think it's clear that the writers don't really know what to do with Sam anymore. While she is the female captain of Miyagi, though, they don't really give her much to do in part 2. There isn't that inherent hatred or rivalry towards Tori anymore. Or their rivalry, if you will. I wouldn't even really call it a rivalry at this point. There's just no weight to it anymore. Not helped out at all by the fact that Tori is feuding with a whole other person in the Sekai Taikai tournament, and Zara from the Iron Dragons. Because of that, a lot of the time that we do get to see Sam on screen outside of the fight, she kind of is just off doing random things. Like, you know, I already mentioned she strikes up a brief friendship with Axel that doesn't go anywhere. And as much as I like the story overall in part 2, I think Cobra Kai does a pretty good job overall pertaining to who wins, who loses, which teams gets eliminated. They almost get you believing they were going to subvert your expectations a bit and be bold, to only unfortunately pull out the rug from under you and find some loopholes to keep everybody intact pretty much. To be completely honest, with all these different loopholes and these substitutions that teams make throughout the tournament, I don't know how they ever get a successful Sekai Taikai tournament going on. Between the Sekai Taikai that we see in part 2 and then some of the lore we learn about previous Sekai Taikai tournaments, it seems like it's just inevitable that this tournament always has some level of drama and mess to it. And this is besides the fact they decide to reincorporate characters from the past, making a surprise return and mess with the tournaments and pull some strings behind the scenes. I can't deny, even though it's messy, I did have some fun with the execution of that idea. I will say, however, despite the finale having some pretty predictable elements to it, as far as battles are concerned in the Sekai Taikai tournament, besides Robbie and Kwan's battle, which I think is the overall best battle of the whole tournament, the other battle that we get in the finale is probably the most insane, chaotic battle we've seen in the entire history of the show to this point. Just in sheer terms of spectacle, brutality, and the choreography standpoint as well. It's pretty much an uninterrupted 15+ minute brawl between everybody that had me right on edge to the entire time until the shocking conclusion of it all leading into part 3. The cliffhanger ending here did kind of surprise me a bit, even though they kind of did allude to it a little bit throughout the show, just because I didn't think they'd actually go that far and then conclude on that, which makes me all the more angry that we have no idea yet when part 3 is coming out with this kind of cliffhanger, which leads me into my warning I said earlier that we're going to talk a little bit of spoilers. Okay, so besides the fact that there is that reveal that Terry Silver not only is back, but he's pretty much is backing the Iron Dragons, which is kind of a cool twist, but not completely surprising in the least either. The more surprising thing here, which I was pretty disappointed by, is the shocking death of Kwan in the Sekai Taikai tournament. In part 2, it was heavily teased once we got the reveal that Mr. Miyagi killed somebody in the Sekai Taikai tournament back in the day, that these tournaments used to be a whole lot worse as far as brutality, with so many winks and nods to how brutal it used to be and how often we saw in play Kreese's knife. Even the shot we saw of it in the trailer, you had to wonder, is somebody gonna get stabbed with that thing? And Kreese did try it once to stab Silver and didn't really go anywhere. It made it all the more shocking when Kwan decides to just go all out batshit insane, do a crazy spinning kick against Axel in this huge brawl at the end, and ends up falling on the knife and dying and cutting the cameras leading into part 3. Not gonna lie, not only was I just disappointed because Kwan died, it's the fact that he had so much potential to be a continuously huge force as an antagonist, so it's sad in more ways than one that we're gonna have that cut short by him passing away. It has me intrigued and nervous what the future holds in part 3. Are they gonna be able to actually continue on with the Sekai Taikai tournament even though somebody literally died? Unfortunately, with Kwan's death, that also leaves in the possibility of someone coming in and replacing him for the tournament. I don't know necessarily who that's going to be if they end up going down that route, who they would actually choose to replace Kwan. All I know though is I really need to know when part 3 is coming out, because the ending for part 2 just really made me upset that we have no idea when next year it's going to be coming out. So hopefully sooner rather than later. But let me know down below though, what'd you think of part 2 of season 6 of Cobra Kai? Did you like it? Did you not like it? Thank you guys, as always, checking out the videos. I always do appreciate it. Make sure to like on the video and also subscribe to the channel so update reviews, reactions, unboxings, and more. Till next time, I'll see you guys later.